So, and for you, Dick, where do your ideas come from? What triggers your involvement?
Before I answer that question, can I tell one other story from Cape Breton?
They would lynch me if I said no.
Ruth, many years ago, one of Ruth's brothers, no longer with us, of course. No, I'll clean it up. Was visiting a friend of his who was a coal miner, lived in rather humble circumstances, and he dropped into the house, and it was supper time, and they were a family such as which was father, mother, and a young boy were sitting at the table, and the mother was trying to cajole this kid into eating his supper. Meanwhile, Ruth's brother and father were talking, and the mother was cajoling, and he wasn't really finishing his supper. Finally, the father got fed up, and he leaned over, and he says to the kid, "Eat your goddamn supper, or I'll knock your effing teeth down your throat." And the mother leans over to my brother-in-law and says, "He's using psychology." What?
They're consulting on what they can say.
Oh, yeah. Ruth is reminding me of some of the Cape Breton experiences when I was a student. We used to sit around. There were 4 doctors in town, and New Waterford was actually the birthplace of Medicare because they had a system called the checkoff, where a certain amount was deducted from each miner's salary every week, and that paid for the 4 doctors who were in town who provided medical care to the whole family. And that was years before we had Medicare in Canada. At any rate, we used to sit around every morning in the so-called surgeon's lounge, which was about the size of this table, and the doctors would talk about their experiences the night before. One of the doctors was a fellow from the Marguerite, and he talked in an accent you don't hear much anymore because of television has eradicated accents, but he had the real sing-song Marguerite accent. You know what I mean. At any rate, sorry. At any rate, I always need instruction. This doctor was talking. He had been called out that night on a stormy night to deliver a baby at home. There were still occasional home deliveries then. This particular woman was in labor in a small miner's shack, and there were about 10 siblings around. It was a stormy night, so they had no place to go, so they stood around sort of watching the action. And one of the little boys said to the doctor, "Listen, Doc, how did that baby get inside my mother's stomach?" He said, "Well, your father planted a seed there." Kid says, "Go on, don't give me that shit." He said, "Well, my old man's too lazy to even mow the lawn." But I digress. The question.
So apart from your career as a stand-up comic, you have started a lot of things. And I know that from working with you at Children's Hospital, and I also think of things like Read to Me and the Discovery Center. But you've started as many things as Ruth has been involved with.
Not as well.
I wasn't trying to be judgmental. But do ideas just pop into your head in the middle of the night, or does somebody come along and say, "Dick, what about this?" Where does it come from?
Well, I think to a large extent I'm what they call in Cape Breton a thief. I steal things. But sometimes certain situations kindle ideas. I don't hardly know where to begin, but certainly when I came to Halifax at the old Halifax Children's Hospital, which perhaps 1 or 2 people in the room will remember, it was a pretty grim kind of institution. And I was interested in how, and this is where Liz becomes involved, in what was being done for the children, both in terms of their education and in terms of recreation. Well, in those days we had 2 rather ancient ladies. One was called the play lady, and the other was the teacher. The interesting thing was these 2 ladies were completely on the outs and did not speak to each other. That was the first thing. The second thing was I discovered that all the toys were locked up at 4:30 every afternoon when the lady went home. She was afraid some child might take one of the toys home. Well, I was pretty distressed about this, and so I knew about a program at Johns Hopkins that I think was the first one called the Child Life Program, and decided that we should have such a program. And I heard about this charismatic teacher at the grammar school, so speaking of thieves, I decided to steal her, which I did, and that was Liz Crawford.
Impoverished your child's education because I couldn't teach him anymore.
And she started what became really the premier child life program in Canada, in my opinion. I think it probably still is. And this was the whole idea of making the hospital experience something that goes far beyond medical care in the traditional sense. So that was certainly one thing that was a major influence on me. There were so many things to do. This was virgin territory in a sense, and I don't say this about myself, but when I came here, there were only, I think, 3 pediatricians outside of Halifax in Nova Scotia. And one of them I knew quite well, and he wasn't too sharp. But in any case, I decided, this wasn't right, that people were constantly having to travel sometimes a couple of hundred miles to Halifax to get their child evaluated by a specialist. At any rate, I sat down with the map of Nova Scotia and arbitrarily decided that no family should have to go more than 30 miles to see a pediatrician. So this was like something kids do in school. I took a pair of, a compass? A compass. And I drew 30-mile circles around Truro, New Glasgow, Yarmouth, etc. And the circles all touched by the time I dealt with all the major population centers, and I could determine at a glance pretty well how many pediatricians we needed in Halifax. But then I needed somebody to do the legwork out in the field, and there was a young woman who was then, I think, in 3rd year of medicine, and she was a nun, the first nun ever. She was a sister of charity. She kicked the habit in 2nd year, but she remained a devoted sister and does to this day. Her name was Nuala Kenny, and she wanted to go into pediatrics, but she wasn't quite sure exactly what she wanted to do. And I said, "Oh, I got a job for you." At any rate, when she got finished her training, we sent her out. The sisters gave her a car, and she spent 2 years on the road visiting every significant center that had a regional hospital in Nova Scotia, doing a careful, systematic evaluation of their facilities for children, the training of their personnel, and so on, and then submitted a report to them. It became quickly apparent that every one of those places needed a pediatrician or 2, and I am pleased to say that they all have pediatric specialists in their areas now. So that was one of the things I was quite proud of, though I did very little of the work. And that's the real secret of success, is to come up with the ideas and then get some bright person to implement them, and then you take all the credit.